there's a difference in the sort of passion in the display when people are being watched versus when it's just a sort of one-on-one conversation. And so, I've had these one-on-one conversations, sort of questioning or challenging some of these views. And one-on-one, it's a much more, just less contentious discussion versus in groups. Suddenly, there's this sort of, the turning red and the anger and the raising of the voice and all of these things that I don't think necessarily, at least in my experience, it doesn't seem to be the case when there's no audience.
I'd like to start by asking you both to share for a few minutes what prompted you to start writing about socioeconomics and the intersection with rhetoric, with wokeness. Rob, you've coined the term luxury belief. Musa, you've been writing about wokeness for a while now. Please take some time to just share with us what got you started and where your head's at right now. Rob, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Again, it's great to be here. Thanks, Kyle. Great to finally get to see you in person, Musa. I have had a few back and forths over Twitter and email. It's the best way to do this, I guess. So you mentioned, of course, I'm currently a PhD student in my final year here at Cambridge. Before this, I did my undergrad at Yale. But before I entered these universities, my life was a lot different. So if I'm, just backing up for a second, I was born in Los Angeles in a poor neighborhood to my mother, who was an immigrant from South Korea. Never met my father. My mother didn't know who he was. My mother became addicted to drugs when I was 3. So I was placed into foster homes where I grew up all around Los Angeles. And eventually I was adopted by this working class family in Northern California in this kind of dusty town called Red Bluff. But there was, sort of divorces and separations and just a lot of drama and chaos, even there too. And so I joined the military and did an enlistment, and then I went to Yale on the GI Bill. And so that was sort of my backstory before entering these universities. And so when I got to Yale, I got out of the military in August. I started classes in September, and then in October, this was autumn of 2015, I saw the student eruptions in response to the sort of infamous Halloween costume email controversy from Erica Christakis. And then there was that sort of viral video with her husband, Nicholas Christakis, in the courtyard of Silliman College. And I was there witnessing that as someone who was just completely outside of this kind of social milieu. And, I was just bewildered by all of it. And I would ask students questions, asking them to explain it to me. Not even necessarily that I disagreed with it, I just didn't understand it. But then when they started to respond with words like, the harm and the pain and the danger it was putting them in and how unsafe they felt and so on, that was when I really started to question and to challenge a lot of what was going on around me. Because, for one, a lot of those words meant something different to me, coming from where I came from, and then hearing, very affluent students in one of the richest universities in the world claim that they were in danger was just very perplexing for me. And around that same time, I was also reading a lot of sort of this old school sociology, Pierre Bourdieu and Thorstein Veblen, and some more modern research from social and evolutionary psychology around social status. And so that was sort of the genesis, I guess, of my idea of luxury beliefs, was linking this sort of interesting phenomenon I was seeing with this social movement and how it was primarily taking place on elite campuses, and how a lot of it seemed to be driven by these concerns of status and anxiety and class. And I've observed some of it here in Cambridge as well, but for now, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. I've got a lot of follow-up questions, but I want to give Musa a chance as well to share the genesis of your work, Musa, and where your head's at right now too.
Well, I'll do that. But first, Rob mentioned briefly this idea of luxury beliefs, but he didn't really explain it. And I think it's a very useful idea that's very helpful for me as I'm thinking and looking through things. So if Rob might be willing to just take a couple minutes and just talk briefly about this idea of luxury beliefs, I think would be very
great.
Yeah, of course. So luxury beliefs, I define as ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And so, this is drawn again from sort of this older work in sociology and more modern psychology research. Basically, in the past, the way that the upper class would display their social rank in society was through material goods, through their luxury goods. I wrote a long form piece about this, showing how the old aristocracy and whatnot, they would wear, expensive clothing and pocket watches and monocles and evening gowns. And 100 years ago, if you walked through Manhattan, you would easily be able to tell just through people's appearance and dress who was wealthy and who wasn't. And today, this is less true for a couple of different reasons, but essentially, social class is appearance is a less reliable indicator, say, of social class than it was in the past. And my claim is that now people are demonstrating their social class and their rank in society through luxury beliefs rather than luxury goods. So having sort of these unusual and sometimes bizarre ideas and opinions, and ideas and opinions that are often at odds with sort of ordinary people with conventional opinion in society, what the sort of typical person on the street might believe. A good way to distance yourself and show that you're not one of the sort of unwashed masses is to hold a luxury belief, something that's sort of uncommon or counterintuitive. But often these counterintuitive ideas can be detrimental to people who are not in sort of fortunate economic or social circumstances. They're often not great even for people who are in fortunate circumstances, but they are more able to withstand the detrimental effects of the effects of their beliefs, simply because of having greater access to economic resources and social capital and so forth. And so now I think a lot of what we're seeing, the sort of social justice movements and so forth, that Musa and others have done a great job documenting how this is disproportionately, these are beliefs held by the affluent. It's not a coincidence. They want to show that they are a member of the upper class.
Yes. Awesome. Okay, so now I'll dive into a little bit of my own. So my own story is very different from Rob's, but there are some points of overlap. So, all the way through 2016, I basically spent my whole life in a smallish southern Arizona military town, about 40 minutes from the US-Mexico border, in a community that was helping keep the state red. And I kind of came of age politically in the aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terror. And at that time, I subscribed to what you could call the banal liberal understanding that a lot of people I'm surrounded by today still subscribe to, which is with respect to like who's responsible for various social problems, and that those damn Republicans, like if only I thought if only people here in Podunk, Arizona could be more like the enlightened denizens of New York, what a beautiful country this could be, basically. And I'd already shed a lot of that in the years that followed, but whatever little bits of that were left were destroyed when I got here in Manhattan to attend Columbia University. And so one of the first things that stood out to me when I got here was that there's, for the lack of a better word, there's basically a racialized caste system here that everyone takes as natural. So you have disposable servants who will clean your house, they'll watch your kids, they'll walk your dogs, they'll deliver prepared food for you if you need something from the store. Someone else will go to the store and get things for you and drop it off at your place. People will show up outside your door to take you wherever you want to go with a push of a button. And it's mostly minorities and immigrants, lower income people, and specifically people from very particular racial and ethnic backgrounds who tend to fill these roles, while people from other racial and ethnic backgrounds who are better off are the ones who are being served. And this is all taken for granted, that this is just the normal way society operates. And yet, again, the way things that operate here in New York or LA or places like that, that's not how things operate in most other parts of the country. So for instance, in other American locales, the person buying a pair of shoes and the person selling that pair of shoes are likely to be the same race, probably white. And the socioeconomic gaps between the person buying and the person selling are likely to be much smaller as well. So, even the most bigoted, the most sexist, racist, bigoted, rich white person who lives in other contexts wouldn't be able to just casually exploit women and minorities and the poor and whatever in the same way that a typical professional in a city like Seattle or San Francisco does in their day-to-day life. The sort of infrastructure for exploitation isn't there. It's these progressive bastions that are associated with the knowledge economy that have these kind of well-oiled machines for sort of exploiting and casually discarding the vulnerable and the disadvantaged. And so that was like one of the things that got me thinking about this, is just kind of observing the milieu in New York. But then really my thoughts started shifting even more. Basically in the aftermath of the 2016 election. So a few months after I arrived here at Columbia, Trump won. And I didn't think that was surprising. I'd been arguing for a lot of the cycle that he was probably going to win. But that wasn't that was not the prevailing mindset and among my peers. And so in the aftermath of Trump's 2016 victory, I was shocked. Like, so in the immediate aftermath, in the days that followed, for instance, here in Columbia, a lot of students claimed to be kind of so traumatized by the electoral result that they couldn't do their tests and their homework. They needed time off. They needed all of these accommodations. And there were a couple of things about this that were striking to me. The first thing that was striking is that these are students at an Ivy League school, right? So these are at an Ivy League university. These are people overwhelmingly from wealthy backgrounds. Even if they didn't come from wealthy backgrounds, you're likely to leave successful. Columbia is an elite school, which is to say, it's a school that's designed to cultivate elites. And it's not a secret. Like, students come to a school like Columbia instead of their local land-grant university because they want to be more elite than other college graduates, and college graduates are themselves an elite in society. So these are people who are the elites of the elites, right? And so even in their own self-descriptions, even in students' own self-descriptions about the impact of the 2016 election and what it would be. So that in their own self-descriptions, the poor and the vulnerable would be crushed underfoot, while elites would flourish better than ever. Well, guess what? We're the elites, right? So realistically speaking, we're the type of people in their own narratives who stood to benefit from someone like Trump winning. But there didn't seem to be any awareness of this on campus. Instead, my fellow students seem to think of themselves as the little guy, as victims, and they viewed themselves as somehow uniquely vulnerable to Trump and his regime, as especially threatened or harmed. And so they demanded all these accommodations for themselves, and the university obliged, of course. But meanwhile, there was this whole other constellation of folks in the university around them who seemed largely invisible to the students. So the landscapers, the maintenance workers, the people preparing food, the security guards. There was no movement on campus on their behalf. And these were the people, according to the prevailing narratives, according to the students' own narratives, these are the people who stood to lose the most from Trump's victory, right? And while the students were upwardly mobile, these workers were generally from more humble backgrounds. They were disproportionately immigrants and minorities. But again, the students didn't think that those people needed protections or days off. They weren't lobbying for higher pay or better benefits for them. They were focused on themselves. And these ignored laborers, the people with most, they weren't saying that they needed more time off. They weren't saying they were traumatized. They weren't uncontrollably sobbing about politics as they scrubbed rich kids' mess out of the toilet. They just showed up and did their jobs and the next day. And so this juxtaposition was sobering. And very briefly, like, I just want to be clear that I'm not, in saying this, I'm not trying to pick on Columbia students here, right? So when I left campus and I was walking around New York, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. The winners of the prevailing order were out on the streets, walking around in a daze like a bomb went off. They were comforting each other and weeping for the disadvantaged with their little safety pin things, even as they were being chauffeured around and waited upon even more than usual because they were just too distraught to do anything themselves. And they were able to indulge themselves in this way, of course, because the people who were serving them, i.e. the people with the most at stake in this election, according to liberals' own narratives, those people showed up and did their jobs. They showed up to work as usual. And New York was not unusual in this respect either. All of these other knowledge economy hubs, similar scenes were playing out in Chicago and LA, and the same things that I observed at Columbia were playing out at colleges and universities around the country. And this is what I found so troubling and it's hard to shake off, is that it wasn't about my own school. It wasn't about my own, the city that I was living in. It was about this kind of broader disjuncture between sort of knowledge economy elites and their narratives about the world and the sort of realities on the ground. And then these contradictions, which are already sharp after 2016, they grew especially pronounced in the wake of COVID-19 and the uprisings that followed in the wake of George Floyd and things like this. And so those are some of the things that led me to writing the book.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both.
It's funny. I was an undergrad at Yale during the 2016 election, and I distinctly remember. I mean, it was the same thing. Students not showing up to class, professors canceling. I mean, so I went to class the day after the election, and I just went to class. I just didn't think like I was, even at that point, I was still so disconnected from politics that I thought like, wow, this is really surprising. Like it's, I'm sure some people are going to be upset, but like class and life goes on. So I went to class. And there was no one there. And then a female student shows up, and we're just both sitting there for like 15 minutes, doing what's, playing around on our phones as students do. And then we look at each other like, is there going to be class today? Like, what's going on here? And then we both check our email, and the professor sent an email saying, I'm sure many of you are upset by the events and blah, blah, and we're going to cancel class today. And so we both just look at each other like bewildered by this. And then we started talking. I'd never really talked to her much before. And then basically she slowly revealed that, she was a supporter of the victor of that election, and that she would never tell anybody this and blah, blah, blah. But and she was, and so I found it just shocking that, that classes were canceled over something like this. And then throughout that week at other classes, professors would preface their classes or their lectures with these sort of like, many of you must be upset, and my door is always open, and the office hours and all this. And I'm like, are you serious right now? Like does this need, like, now we need to like make this sort of these announcements before each class, acknowledging people's pain and suffering, and you can come talk to me. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, what's why does this need to be done? Like, are we, because on the one hand, often the narrative is like, oh, you're all adults, you're all capable, you're all, whatever. If you want to get drunk and do drugs and have fun and party and stuff, like, it's not our business. Like, you're all adults. That was sort of what a lot of the administration and faculty would say. And then something like this happens, and suddenly it's, oh, you all must be so upset, and we're here for you. And there was this double message of, you're the future leaders of the world, but then you're all being erased and marginalized, and we're here to protect you. And the mental gymnastics involved, it was something that took me a while to fully understand and to be able to I suppose even be able to communicate it in this way, because it was so confusing for me.
So that's possibly my key question for both of you today. How, in your research and your experiences, how does somebody find their way into a luxury belief? How much of it is, I don't want to say conscious as in malicious. Like, I mean, I think if you pointed out a luxury belief to somebody and they agreed with you that it was, and hopefully they would drop it. But did you find people at all self-aware? Do you find that awareness can shift when this is pointed out to people? And Musa, in terms of wokeness more fundamentally, and Rob, in terms of luxury beliefs. And I asked that both in terms of how listeners can sort of avoid it themselves, but also when we're engaging with people who it's clear are in a cycle like this, just to better understand the various mindsets and like get someone into that headspace in the first place, right?
Well, okay, so I think it can work sometimes. I think for the most part, it's not necessarily like luxury beliefs and espousing these views. It's not necessarily malicious for the most part. There are some people who are kind of cynical and using it in a tactical way, but I think by and large, people are just saying things that they need to say, and they're not necessarily intentionally using it to obtain power or status or anything. I've had some like very limited success talking to people one-on-one about it, but whenever there's a group involved and whenever there are other people to impress, then all bets are off, and it's not, in my experience at least, it's not really worth engaging, because so much of these beliefs are social in terms of like why they're espoused. They're not necessarily believed or espoused for their truth value, but more for their social value. And so when you can have like a one-on-one honest conversation, I found that often people will sort of second guess and reflect and be more thoughtful about it. But in a group, it's just, it's not really worth it.
Yeah, I mean, so similar. So in the book, I explore a little bit how social justice discourse doesn't seem to relate too much to like inegalitarian behaviors on the part of elites, right? So there doesn't seem to be a good correspondence between what people profess and how they act in the world. And I also demonstrate in the book how social justice discourse, though, does seem to serve a range of alternative functions for elites. So it can help us signal or reinforce our elite status, as Rob talked about. It can enhance, certain positions that people take seem to be struck to help enhance their moral or epistemic authority, or to enhance their perceptions of merit, or legitimize their own social position, or delegitimize, their opponents, or kind of justify different relationships or states of affairs, right? So it serves all these other functions, but there's this kind of tendency in conversations and how people think and talk about things, where insofar as you can show that people's sort of material interests seem to inform their beliefs, this is often interpreted as a sign of like cynicism or insincerity. And I don't think that's a good way to think about thinking. So the truth is, our brains are kind of designed to interpret the world in a way that enhances our success or furthers our goals. And so we readily believe things and focus on information and ideas that are sort of pleasurable or useful to embrace. And we tend to avoid and resist or abandon information or ideas that are inconvenient or detrimental. And so this is how our brains are fundamentally wired. And so there's no contradiction then in assuming that a belief or identity claim is sincere, while also recognizing that it serves people's material or social interests, right? There's not a contradiction in observing that a sincerely held belief would be deployed instrumentally, because the more useful a belief or identity is, the more sincerely it's likely to be held, actually. Having an interest in striking a particular position doesn't undermine sincerity, it usually enhances it, right? And so shifting the frame a little bit away from sincerity, in the book, my sort of default is to assume, I just start with the assumption that when people are saying these things, that they mean them, that they're sincere. I don't, attribute cynicism or bad faith, and in fact, I don't even really focus too much on those kinds of questions, because it's because you can't really see inside of other people's heads or hearts or whatever. What I can observe as a social scientist are things like discourse and behaviors and things like this. And this leads me to one thing that I think is important in sort of shifting this frame around questions of sincerity or whatever, is just because a belief is sincere to someone doesn't mean it's very important to them, right? And whether or not something is important to someone, whether it's a priority for them, this actually is something that you can easily observe empirically. Because if something is a priority for someone, if something is important to them, if it's central to them, then that tends to be manifested in action, right? If something is valuable to you, you make room for it. You change how you operate. It changes your behaviors. It changes your other commitments and relationships and plans. And so the truth is, from what I gather, I think a lot of these beliefs are, people sincerely hold them. When they're crying, I don't think they're fake crying. I think they're genuinely sad. When they're passionate and they're arguing and they're turning red, I don't think that's a performance. I think it's their genuine feelings. But for all that, despite being sincere, it's also clear that a lot of these commitments aren't that important to them. They're not important to people to the point where they're willing to make substantive sacrifices. So they have competing commitments that are more important to them getting ahead in their careers, more important to them supporting their family. And there's nothing morally objectionable about that. But the point is just that these beliefs do seem to be like sincerely held, but they're not central. They're not really central to they're not so important to a lot of people that they're willing to fundamentally structure their behaviors, their way of life, to sort of compromise their life plans.
So Musa, I mean, I wonder though, I mean, I think I agree with you that by and large the beliefs are held sincerely, but I also can't help but think that there's an element of performativity, again, because there's a difference in the sort of passion in the display when people are being watched versus when it's just a sort of one-on-one conversation. And so, I've had these one-on-one conversations, sort of questioning or challenging some of these views. And one-on-one, it's a much more, just less contentious discussion versus in groups. Suddenly, there's this sort of, the turning red and the anger and the raising of the voice and all of these things that I don't think necessarily, at least in my experience, it doesn't seem to be the case when there's no audience to impress. And so, is there a performance there, or is that sort of, is that difference sincere as well?
Well, I think, so it's definitely true. I mean, there's all sorts of really great research that shows that how people interact when they're on display is very different than how they act in sort of more private settings, and especially, and that there are differences also between how people act and interact with each other in sort of remote interactions versus in person, in part because in person you can read all of these bodily cues that might get missed, and you can better read people's emotions, and there's also kind of a physical, like, people can get buck online really easy in a way that they would never get buck like that in person, right? Because there's a like implicit threat of physical escalation such that they would never speak to someone in person the way that they do online a lot of times. So this kind of remote interaction allows for a lot of like chicken hawks. Okay. But so
I also wonder.
While granting that, it's funny. So for a lot of people, for people who work in what I call the symbolic professions, like our whole livelihoods are oriented around, how I say it in the book is like what we know, who we know, and how we're known. So it's like our social networks and our reputation are not just important to us in the way that they're important to everyone else, like, because we want to belong, and it's like if our social networks or our reputation are ruined, like our livelihoods are kind of destroyed too. So there's a lot more at stake in a lot of these public interactions, especially for people like us than for other people. But precisely because there's so much more at stake, again, I think that this informs some of the passion that people see when they're putting on these public performances, right? Like, there's a lot on the line in how people perceive them and how they interact with them. So I think that again, some of that, there's a performative aspect to it, but it's also sincere in the sense that like how people perceive, how this performance is received can influence the course of their life, and they're aware of that, and they're if people see them one way versus another, if they like them versus don't like them, if they're suspicious of them versus not, right? There's a lot on the line there. So I think some of that passion that you see in these interactions isn't just it might not be it's not passion that's purely about, say, George Floyd or the environment or whatever they're talking about, but it's very real all the same, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You kind of touched a little bit on another question I had about online versus in-person interactions. And Musa, you kind of mentioned that being online kind of shields you a bit, like you used the word chicken hawk there. And a reminder to our viewers as well that we are taking questions in a little while, so please get those in. But I'd love to drill down on that a bit too. I mean, our board chair, John Haidt, just published an article in The Atlantic about how social media is tearing us apart, specifically among his reasons, because it's making it easier and easier for things to go viral and for things to spin and for us to be able to not face the consequences of a retweet or an action. And Musa, you spoke about this a bit for just a minute ago. Rob, I'd love to hear from you as well. Luxury beliefs, are they more rampant online? Does online make it easier for someone to actually be that way in person as well? What's the relationship that you've seen there?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is sort of originates and then is propagated online. There was an interesting, so that article from Jonathan Haidt, which I read and I enjoyed, there was a Twitter thread, sort of responding to it, citing data from other sources showing that most Americans in general are not that interested in politics, but then even the ones who are on Twitter are not so political, or on Facebook, and that by and large, politics is a sort of hobby horse of the elite, of the sort of very online, highly educated types. And, basically, I guess taking exception to some of Haidt's claims about how, social media is tearing apart the country. But at first, my first inclination was actually to agree with him, because I've seen so much of this work that, only, what is it, like 10% of Twitter users produce 80% of the tweets. And, of those, a small fraction of them produce the political tweets and so on. But I think they're both right in the sense that social media is actually tearing the elites apart, not regular people. And so the people who are the most knowledgeable about politics, and the people who are the most up to date on the latest fashionable luxury beliefs, I mean, those are the ones who spend the most time online, consume the most political content, who actually know the most about politics, who score the highest on sort of these knowledge quizzes and so on about politics and news. They're the ones who are actually sort of being torn apart and divided by partisanship. And so I think this is sort of a mistake that's generally made in the broader discourse, is that, people are being misinformed, and there's problems with fake news. And if people just knew enough, or if they knew the truth, then a lot of the partisanship would simmer down. But actually, it seems to be the case that the people, like, the more you know about politics, the more interested you are in politics, the more real news you read, actually, the more partisan you become.
Yeah, I talk about this in my, so I agree completely that, so it's funny, so in John Haidt's Coddling of the American Mind, one of the things that a lot of people miss when they were talking about that book is that he was pretty explicit there in that book, that he was talking very specifically kind of about the way that parents of upper middle class, of upper middle class, parents, and the kind of schools and whatever that upper middle class people were sending their kids to, that there was this kind of class dimension to it. And that I'm inclined to read, I think if Haidt had framed his argument in the Atlantic in the same way, and I'm hoping that the book will probably, it's hard, articles can't say everything, but so this is the book that's coming out, I'm sure he'll frame it. I'm hoping that he'll frame it basically in a similar way, because I agree with Rob. I mean, I think the real thing, that the phenomenon that Haidt is pointing out is real, but it's largely concentrated among people like us. And that's not to say it doesn't matter, right? It's highly consequential, because it's people like us who run all the social institutions, right? We're the ones who are running and administering nonprofit organizations. We're the ones teaching people in colleges and universities. We're the ones describing the social world and things like the media. We're the ones who are working government bureaucracies and making decisions and all of this kind of stuff. So this kind of, to the extent that we're going crazy, that's a big problem for the rest of society. It has important downstream implications for the rest of society, including and especially for people who are genuinely marginalized and disadvantaged. But that's very different from saying that, all Americans are going crazy on social media or whatever. That they're not really. It's mostly us, but it matters that we're going crazy.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, it almost seems like this form of projection where, like, the elites see each other saying, outrageous things online, and then we sort of point our finger at regular people, like, oh, people are being misinformed, and suddenly we're just we're blaming regular people for our own kind of behavior and the way that we behave online. There was a study, I just tweeted it out this morning. Basically, the study had people deactivate their Facebook accounts, and there were a bunch of interesting effects, but two of them in particular. So one of them, people just generally became like less knowledgeable about the news, but they were also just like generally less politically involved and less angry, and sort of less their attitudes about politics were just less heated in general. And so, in a way, I think, like, maybe social media is bad, not necessarily because of regular people interacting with it, but rather because elites spend too much time on it and are trying to impress each other too much on it.
Well, and part of the kind of mentality that goes into this projection, I think also is that, I talked about this a little bit in some of the ways that social science research goes awry sometimes too, is that everyone tends to think that they're normal or that they're representative. So social scientists, for instance, their sort of starting assumption is that their beliefs are kind of well-formed and correct. Like people hold their beliefs because they think they're correct, right? So they think that their understanding of the world, their sort of factual, moral understanding of the world is true, and they also think that it's sort of well-formed. But then a consequence of that, and so that's a natural thing that everyone believes. But one consequence of that is that if you believe that that your own beliefs are sort of true and well-formed, then when you notice someone who holds radically different views than you, the sort of natural thing to wonder isn't like, it's basically what's wrong with those people, right? It's to assume that there must be something wrong with them, that they're irrational or misinformed or immoral or whatever. And so social scientists often use ourselves as a baseline to understand other people and their beliefs and their actions. And I think this is true for elites more generally, right? As they think of themselves as the baseline against which other people should be measured in a way that's when in fact in a lot of cases, like we're the weird ones actually. Like social scientists should spend a little bit more time rather than going, why do those people believe those things that they believe, go, why do we believe such weird things? Like, because the things that we believe are actually pretty unusual compared to, like, we're the ones who are the aberrations. We're the ones with the weird, idiosyncratic, fringy views. But instead,
well, weird in both senses of the word, right?
Yes,
weird
yes,
in the sort of Western, educated, industrialized. Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. Well, I mean, one of the things that was interesting to me as sort of as I began research in psychology and political psychology in particular, was just like how much research there is on conservatives. Why are conservatives like that? Why do they vote for this? Why don't they vote in their own interest? Always in terms of economics, their own economic interest, maybe not necessarily in terms of the values that they hold. And even the way that the scales are designed, like if it's a scale from 1 to 7 on political orientation, 7 is always conservative so that you can easily check correlations, so it's always a positive correlation between conservatism and something else. It's never a correlation between liberalism and something. It's always conservatives tend to believe XYZ. And there are other examples of this too. And so, yeah, and I don't really find much in political psychology about why liberals are the way that they are. And yeah, this probably is a reflection to some degree. I think it's a reflection of bias, but also I think like there is at least more recently, I think there is a growing self-awareness that, yeah, there is some kind of maybe political bias at play in a lot of the social sciences, but it's also risky. It's risky to research liberals, especially if you find a result that isn't flattering, to get that past peer review. And then like once there's a press release and you start tweeting about it or whatever, like it's risky to find things about your own tribe that maybe don't reflect so well on them. But if you can find something bad about the other tribe, it's all gravy.
So there's actually a question that just came in about that. I just want to get it out there. Then Musa, please feel free. Someone just asked, why are luxury beliefs so uniformly culturally liberal? Is that something that you've actually seen, right? And Musa, sorry, dive in.
Oh no, yeah.
Well, okay, so it's funny. Some people have accused me of this about like, oh, aren't luxury beliefs, this whole concept like a Trojan horse to ridicule the political left or something. And it's actually I don't think it is. I think it's much more about class than about political affiliation. There are, I guess luxury beliefs that would actually be more associated with the right. I guess like a couple off the top. So one would be more recently this sort of anti-vaccination thing. Like you saw a lot of like Republican politicians or Fox News anchors or whatever, you know, they were getting vaccinated and made sure their families were getting vaccinated, but then they go on TV and say, oh, you know, we're not so sure about this vaccine, or you know, whatever, calling into question the policies or the mandates or whatever. So, you know, in their own private lives for themselves and their loved ones, they're making sure they get vaccinated, but, you know, they're sort of promulgating views that may not be so good for the less fortunate.
Yeah.
You know, so that's just like one example. I mean, but generally speaking, I think it is a bit more about class. Because so I was raised, at least for a portion of my childhood, my adoptive mother and her partner, you know, so my mother, after she divorced my adoptive father, fell in love with this woman, and she and my mother raised me together. And they were like working class Democrats. They were like John Kerry supporters in 2004. I remember they had like the stronger America bumper sticker. The Kerry, I can't even remember his running, Kerry Edwards, 2004. They had that on, and so, but they say things and make comments that would immediately get them canceled at any elite university. I mean, even small things like you know, like their views on gender, right? Even though they are, you know, two lesbian women who generally support LGBT stuff, you know, like they would call into question some of the trans rights stuff or the movement there, or even other like smaller things, I guess, like, I don't know, sweeping generalizations about gender or making comments about someone's weight. You know, they're not like body positivity kind of people. You know, if someone is overweight, they'll just say like, yeah, that person's fat, you know, and that would upset a lot of people at Yale, for example, or imitating the accents of other ethnic groups, or just like all of this stuff that like, it's not intended to be malicious or anything, but it's just like how working class, non-college educated people communicate. And like, regardless of race, right? Like that's just like across the board. And so, the luxury beliefs, like they, you know, I guess a more recent example of this that I was just reading about, like the Latinx idea, right? Like the vast majority of Hispanic people in the U.S., especially working class Hispanics, don't agree with this term at all. And you know, like the term Latinx is a kind of a luxury belief that they would not want to adopt or to promote.
Interesting.
Yeah, and some of them, and yeah, and a lot of these luxury beliefs, as Rob mentioned, they're not even beliefs that necessarily fall on the left-right spectrum, right? So you see a lot of tech companies and tech-affiliated people pushing devices into schools as like the key to like learning, and these will help these poor underprivileged kids. But then when you look at where the schools they send their own kids to, they're device free, and in their own household, the use of these devices is like heavily regulated, or they're not even used in the house. So they're, you know, for their own children, they recognize the harm that these devices can potentially cause. And for their own children and their own children's learning, they do not recognize these as being valuable. But for poor kids, they say, this is the solution that will help you, you know, move up the ladder, right? And so like, that's an example of this kind of thing that they espouse. But again, that has nothing to do with, that's not like a left
politics
thing or a right.
It's not political.
That's
yeah. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So I have so many more questions for you myself, but we have questions coming in that are meaty and rich. So I think I want to shift to some of those because they can really help continue us along here. Here's one. What has changed? These aspects that you're both describing. Is this a new realization of long-term concepts, or has the context actually changed? Is this another way to put it? Is this a new instantiation of an old problem, or part of an evolution of society?
Sure, I can.
I think that. Oh,
go
go ahead.
ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, I mean, I think the desire for status has always been there, and the desire to sort of display your erudition and your rank in society and so forth. I mean, this has been around for ages. But I think what's different is that at least when status was linked directly to material goods, there was you know, the speed with which these luxury goods could be purchased and then displayed were, I mean, it was inhibited based on the fact that you had to buy the newest items and so forth, and they're often like difficult to acquire. Whereas luxury beliefs, I mean, you know, you can open up Twitter and see some trending hashtag of some new term, and then you see it in the like prestige media outlets, and suddenly everyone has to use this term or hold this belief or this view or something, and it just moves much quicker. I mean, a lot of the things that we're talking about and things that are sort of taken now for granted among the chattering classes were like they didn't exist even 5 years ago or 6 years ago. So there's this it's just the sort of quickening of the pace as a consequence, I think, largely of social media.
Hmm.
And then, for my own, in the book, I kind of, so in the book, what I do is I show using a whole bunch of data, including like this. So this, you mentioned this article in the Atlantic that I wrote. So me and my colleague, David Rosato, together we built this corpus of 27 million news articles from 47 media outlets over the past 50 years. And what we show is that starting around after 2010, there was this, starting in 2011, really, there was this kind of radical shift in discourse in media. Namely, the media started talking about, started using prejudice denoting terms much more, and for all types of prejudice. So not just race, but also, concern about misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, et cetera, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, just kind of across the board. And it showed in left media and right media and center media. It showed in TV and print alike. We show, okay, and so that's just one data point. But you can look across the board in a lot of things, in public opinion polling, in books. If you look at Google Books and the use of terms, you see the same thing. If you look at public opinion polling, there's this radical shift in attitudes and how, in particular, highly educated white liberals respond to opinion polls starting around the same period, especially on issues related to what you could call social justice. So there's this like significant movement among elites in terms of their discourse, in terms of their expressed attitudes, that starts after 2010 and that we're in the middle of today. But what's critical that we mention in the paper and that I show in the book using a whole bunch of other data sources as well, is that this movement that we saw starting after 2010 wasn't the first awakening or the only one. As I show in the book, there were 3 other periods like this as well. There was one in the late 80s through the early 90s. That was the last one. And we saw a lot of these same debates around political correctness on campus and identity politics and all of this stuff. And you see it in the data, the same spikes and things like this. So there was one in the late 80s to early 90s. There was, of course, one in the mid 60s through the mid 70s. And then there was another one prior to those, actually, in the 20s through the 30s. And so in the book, what I show, as I look at these different periods of awakening, in order to draw out sort of what they hold in common. So under what circumstances do these awakenings emerge? What do they change, if anything? Under what circumstances do they tend to dissipate, and why? And so in the book, so I guess the short answer is that there is something novel to this moment, but it's not like fully unprecedented. Each of these awakenings is a little different from each other. It is different, for instance, that we have the internet and social media now that informs kind of the character of this awakening in non-trivial ways compared to the 1920s or 1930s, for instance. The kind of communications technologies, and as well as the kind of shifting influence of the people for whom these awakenings are undergoing. Like in all of these cases, it's the same people who are undergoing these awakenings. It's people like us, but people like us, I call them in the book symbolic capitalists, drawing from Bourdieu. Our role in society has changed significantly as well over the past, century. So the awakenings aren't the same, but they're also, but there's a lot that they hold in common.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear that rhythm throughout the century. It sounds like there's every decade or so, there's this decade pause, right? or so, and then another swing. So does that mean, Musa, I'm curious, since you've been charting this, I know this is impossible to actually predict, but how far into this awakening do you think we are? You know, what do you see as the trajectory of this awakening based on?
How long were the other ones?
Yeah.
I'm just curious. How long did the previous ones last?
Yeah. So there's actually there is a bit of predictability to them. Usually they're about 10 years. Although the one in the late 80s to early 90s was shorter. It was about 5 years. And I show in the book, actually, there's a reason for that, because the conditions that give rise to the awakenings were resolved sooner during that period. But typically they last about 10 years. And you already see you see some conversations right now about a vibe shift that some people are calling it, or whatever, that's happening right now. And you're seeing this kind of, so my suspicion is that we could be towards the tail end, but I say that with a caveat, because it's actually not clear to me that some of the conditions that tend to precipitate these awakenings, sort of socioeconomic pressures on elites that tend to lead them into kind of engaging in these behaviors. It's not clear to me that those have been adequately resolved yet. But so I don't know. If I had to guess, though, if you were going to put a gun to my head and ask me this question of like what phase, like how close or far, I would say we're probably towards the tail end of the current moment. But TBD.
Right. Right. So you both have underscored that there are some ancient things to this, ancient things to our human nature that cause us to be moving into these cycles constantly. There's a question here that asks, it seems as if we are constantly reinforcing these ideas and letting others name themselves. The term elite being a perfect example and being used regularly by those very self-proclaimed elites. We've done that several times in this chat too. The question is, how do we encourage people to stop relating to groups and instead to ideas and individuals? I think I would provide a caveat to that. How do we encourage people to relate as individuals? And what is the proper temper of group to individual, right? And group to idea? Let either one of you take that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not even, I think ideally we would like to take ideas from, or discuss ideas as individuals and not as members of groups. But group membership has become so salient recently, and specifically among elites. I mean, one idea that I floated on a podcast a while back was, like, why is this the case? Because for a while we were sort of inching towards, especially I think during the Obama era, inching more and more towards this, at least the ideal of this sort of post-racial, like race was not considered a big deal. I mean, if you look at the patterns from surveys on race relations, for example, they were very high during like the late 2000s. And then they've sort of plummeted since sort of this great awakening period that Musa is talking about. But the idea was basically that in the past, I mean, when ordinary typical Americans were like legitimately racist, the elites were the ones who were championing individuality and judging people based on the content of their character and so on, and trying to sort of get beyond race. And now that idea, I think, has more or less trickled down throughout society to the point where sort of middle and working class people don't really think of race as an important feature of day-to-day life. And at least they agree with the ideal of getting past racism. Now the elites are shifting back towards re-racializing society and thinking back in terms of group membership. One possibility is in order to distance themselves from the conventional opinion. Now that the conventional opinion is, colorblindness, now colorblindness is among elites is kind of treated as this meme of like, oh, colorblindness, ha ha ha, you're such a backwards idiot for thinking that we could ever be colorblind in our horrible racist society. And so I think how do we get elites to go back to trying to champion individuality again? I'm not sure. maybe once we get past this sort of tail end period that Musa is talking about, that we can get there. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Musa, on how to get past it.
I have a slightly different take on it. I'll note though briefly. It's like you mentioned, color blindness is unpopular now. I mean, within sociology and a lot of other social research fields, like color blindness is literally considered a form of racism today.
Yeah.
There's this whole notion of colorblind racism that's become very prevalent in the field of sociology and in other social sciences fields as well, such that if you express colorblind beliefs, they literally use the expression of colorblind beliefs as a measure of racism in a lot of so this idea, which was originally promulgated as a means of overcoming racism, is now used literally as a measure of racism in a lot of social science research. But I think to me, the challenge isn't so much trying to suppress people from thinking of themselves in terms of groups and to think of themselves as individuals instead. I think a more promising avenue for mitigating some of these things, for getting people to take each other more seriously, to engage with each other in good faith, to not villainize and demean and degrade and engage in this politics of humiliation, really, which is kind of an anti-politics. Right, this politics of humiliation, precisely what it does is it prevents people from organizing. It prevents people from getting together. It prevents people. It's kind of an anti-politics. Politics is all about forming coalitions with other people to achieve goals. This kind of humiliation stuff is basically an anti-politics. So I think the solution to it, honestly, isn't to eliminate people's understanding of, to kind of suppress or eliminate people thinking about themselves in terms of groups or whatever. I think the solution is to build bigger superordinate identities under which these other umbrellas could, right? So, emphasizing things that people have in common despite these differences, right? So what do we share in common? What unites us? What, how can we move forward together? I think that's a more promising thing when you can engage with someone else and you view them not as part of a different tribe, but as part of the same tribe, as part of the same, maybe a different subgroup, but of the same basic tribe. Then you interact with them in a totally different way than if you understand them as part of a different group, or even as if you understand them as like atomized individuals or whatever. I actually have kind of a hard time understanding people in that way also, because I think, I think even individuals, this notion of an atomistic individual is strange. I mean, I think people are just kind of fundamentally social, even ourselves, what ourselves are, is fundamentally tied into all of these other people, and in the context that we grow up in all of this other stuff. I don't think, this kind of separation of the self from society is. So I think a more promising, both kind of, I guess, metaphysically, but then also kind of practically, is to focus more on building superordinate identities and looking at things that we have in common. And this is actually my chief grievance with some of this stuff. Again, this is kind of, it's basically functions as an anti-politics. It prevents people from getting together, from sharing, from uniting, from making progress on a lot of these issues.
That ties in with another question here that pulls this conversation to the work of higher ed and scholarship specifically. In what ways do luxury beliefs and Musa, I'd add wokeness generally, have negative impacts on open inquiry? So how are we seeing this mental habit impact our ability to, as what HxA says, pursue truth and pursue knowledge?
The obvious one is that it becomes a sort of which taboos you adhere to is itself a sort of an indicator of your class and what kinds of media you consume and your level of education and so forth. I mean, certain lines of inquiry are just taboo because you know that if you even broach the question, that it will sort of damage your reputation and your esteem. So, yeah, it has this kind of chilling effect on open inquiry. I mean, I'm reminded there was this story I'd read about of, I think it was Rene Descartes, who wrote a series of essays basically demonstrating evidence of God's existence. And the Catholic Church responded by banning these essays, because the reason here was because he took the question seriously of whether God might exist. And therefore we have to, we have to forbid these from being read, because even the question itself is taboo. And it's, it's easy to see sort of some parallels today, that even the question itself becomes taboo. And I think a marker of this is it's directly related to sort of these issues of class. I mean, there was a survey, I want to say this was by YouGov, either 2021 or 2020, where they asked people if they were concerned about free expression, whether they felt free to express themselves, and whether they would lose, or whether they feared for their jobs or their employment prospects if they were to speak their mind. And they broke it down by education, which I found very illuminating, which was something like only 25% of people with only a high school diploma said that they felt like stifled in terms of free expression. For college graduates, it was 34%. And then for people with postgraduate degrees, it was 44%. So actually, the more educated you are, the less freedom you feel that you have in terms of your ability to express yourself. I mean, 44%, that's like, you flip a coin for whether someone with a postgraduate degree is telling you the truth about certain topics. So yeah. So in any case, yeah, I'll let Musa take it from here. But I do think that like that stat in itself sort of indicates that luxury beliefs are stifling free expression.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that you see a lot of this distortion is it's not so much that people are saying things that they don't believe. I think it's that they avoid saying things that they do believe. Is the main way that this plays out, because it's hard for yeah. And so there's this phenomenon that Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls the minority rule, where you can have a minority sometimes of as little as 5% that can impose its views on the rest of on the institutions. So you can have these institutionally dominant views that most people in the institution don't actually share, but that dominate the institution and to kind of define it. And that can occur in situations where the people in the minority are highly organized and very kind of intolerant of dissent, and again are kind of highly organized and passionate, and they're surrounded by people who are sort of more ambivalent or less organized or kind of sympathetic, don't fully agree but are kind of sympathetic. And you see this like so for instance, a lot of the beliefs on like race, gender, and sexuality and stuff like this that dominate within academia and corporate sphere and all of this. There's a lot of people who kind of privately disagree, but they're sympathetic in some, like they agree with what they're trying to do in principle. They think that they take it too far, or like this is a little, but they kind of agree in principle. And in any case, they don't want to publicly they don't want to be seen as publicly opposed to like anti-racism or publicly opposed to feminism or whatever, right? And so they suppress. So usually they try to. How this plays out is people usually avoid talking about at all, or expressing disagreement with, or just avoiding the topic at all when they disagree. And you see this in scholarship, right? So there are all sorts of questions that are never asked, things that are never really explored, just because, as Rob said. Because even if you explored them, as Rob said, you got it through. Okay, so one other thing that I'll note that I talk about at length in the book that plays in, that's like a very important dimension of this, though, and that ties to this point that Rob said about how you move up education and self-censorship is higher, is that so people like us, people who are highly educated, who are who score high on IQ tests and things like this, like we tend to think of ourselves as this kind of independent thinkers who are rebels and like we just follow the truth wherever it leads. In fact, though, it's kind of the opposite. So when you look at like who succeeds in higher, who's going to make it to a school like who's going to make it through college at all, and especially make it through elite schools, and who's going to end up in elite firms or get a job in one of these knowledge economy fields. Like, so how do you get through college? How do you get through good grades? It's usually, that's the people who show up every day first class. They do their homework on time. They produce essays that satisfy the grown-ups and the teachers, like that conform with what they're expecting in a way that, so we're people who, for the most part, people who end up in places like this are actually not the rebels that get washed out of the system early. They never graduate high school, or they don't go to college, or if they get into college, they wash out. The people who are authentically rebels never end up, oftentimes, with who are the real rebels, never, are unlikely to get college degrees in the first place. And if they get them, and if they end up in these institutions, they often wash out kind of quickly. So these institutions are mostly dominated by people who are like highly competent conformists. And actually, this is one of the things that our degrees signal more than anything, is that we're the kind of person who's going to execute the tasks that we're assigned in like to the letter in a way that they want, and that we're not going to cause a lot of trouble, right? We view our college degrees as a sign that we're these kind of independent free thinkers. It's kind of the opposite. And this is why employers actually are so eager to, even for jobs outside of the knowledge economy, even if you're talking about why degrees tend to hold a premium even on non-knowledge economy jobs, is because we're the kind of, you don't have, and so there's this kind of narrative that when you look at the kind of jobs that we have, the authority structures tend to be less rigorous. Like we don't have direct managers, and we have these more free-flowing kind of, and according to some narratives, this is just because we're too, again, independent. We can't be managed like this. But the truth is, we don't need to be managed that way. We manage ourselves, right? We pride ourselves on going above and beyond, and on making sure that we're like, we are our own managers. Like, you need to manage other people because they're not conformists. You don't need to manage us because we are conformists. We go above and beyond to show how much, yeah. And so,
well, this ties directly into politics too, Musa.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some interesting research on, I think this is from Dan Kahan at Yale, actually, where he showed that the people who are the most partisan are the highly educated people, both Democrat and Republican. So, who believes that climate change is the biggest threat tends to be college-educated Democrats, and who are the least concerned with climate change, who thinks that will sort of like solve this challenge, are college-educated Republicans. Same for abortion, who's the most pro-life versus pro-choice, college-educated Democrats versus Republicans, whereas less educated people, they actually tend to be more moderate and often more centrist in their positions. So it's actually, like a less educated Republican and a less educated Democrat have more in common with one another in their political views than either one of them does with a more college educated person on their own sort of political team. And so something about education makes people very good team players, whatever side they happen to be on, and will be the cheerleader for that side.
I talk about this in the book. Yeah, so there's so people who are highly educated, highly intelligent, et cetera, et cetera. They tend to be so they tend to be more ideological, not only just they think more ideologically, they also tend to be more ideologically extreme. They tend to be more dogmatic. We're also the people who are most likely to to sort of follow partisan cues. So like if the party changes its position on things, who's most likely to change their own position on things? People like us, actually, not not the people who are less educated. We're the ones who change oh, Joe Biden says this, so I believe this now. Like that's people like us, actually. Donald Trump says this, so I believe this now. Like that's highly educated people who are most likely to do that. And less educated people, et cetera, they tend to be more flexible in their thinking. They more readily change their mind in accordance with the facts. And in fact, this is partly the fault of our cognitive abilities, right? Precisely because people who are more cognitively sophisticated or informed, precisely because they have more resources to kind of dismantle inconvenient things to believe. Like we have an easier capacity. We have, it's easier for us to just maintain the vision of the world we want, facts be damned, than other people. It's like easier for us to do that. And so we do. I mean, this is, yeah. And then layered on top of this kind of cognitive difference is, again, the fact that our careers, especially people who work in the knowledge economy, our livelihoods are often based even more than most people on conformity, on on maintaining these relationships, on how people see us, on on our reputation and things like that. So for in the first place, these kind of institutions of higher learning and other institutions like this, they select for people who have a certain cognitive profile, this kind of conformist team player kind of thing. And then when you're in those institutions, that gets reinforced even more. And then we end up working in these jobs where conformity is like very important for us to continue. And so, yeah, there's this narrative about us as these kind of free thinking rebels who, it's basically the opposite of that is the case.
On the point of the sort of cognitive sophistication and having the ability to deploy more resources. I mean, there was a really interesting paper I recently read from Dan Williams here at Cambridge. It's called the Marketplace of Rationalizations. And he basically states that there's a limit to the absurdity of a belief that we can hold. I mean, we have to basically be able to rationalize it. If the belief is too crazy, then we won't go near it. But if it's plausible and someone can provide a rationalization for us that's somewhat plausible and that we want to believe, then we'll purchase that belief. We'll adopt it. But so he basically goes into this argument about how there's this marketplace and there are sort of sellers, people whose sort of job it is to create sophisticated sounding arguments to provide to people. And as I was reading this, I was thinking to myself, well, who has the time? Like, who has the time to exploit this marketplace and shop around for different ideas and find the one that perfectly matches their preference and makes them feel good about themselves and their views? I mean, these are the people who can spend a lot of time online or can read the latest prestige media outlet piece or op-eds or fashionable news items and so forth. And I mean, in some ways, I think that this is why these kind of independent media outlets have sprung up to provide for this market. Places like Substack. I mean, I have a Substack, but I recognize that like they were responding to a demand that wasn't being met by legacy media, and so but who has the time, right, to download the Substack app and read and all that stuff? Like these are the educated people.
Yeah. I hate to cut this off, but we are over time. It's been a fantastic conversation. I love the way we ended here, though. I hear in your conversation a call to self-awareness and continued self-monitoring as we all continue to navigate the news media and to be thinking about the alignment with our own beliefs and our own reading practices and the way we live our lives. Thank you both for that. I really appreciate that. Thank you to our listeners for lots of great questions. There's so much more to say. And I wish we could have more time with Rob and Musa, but both of you, thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. We really appreciate it. We learned a lot.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Musa.